A judge says Ukraine's former prime minister abused her powers while in office. Welcome to Al Jazeera. I'm Sami Zeidan in Doha. Also on our program, the battle for Beni Walid. Libyan fighters say they've taken control of the airport. Voting begins in Liberia's presidential election. And barricading the capital. Thailand braces for the worst floods in decades to hit Bangkok. A judge has ruled that Ukraine's former prime minister exceeded her powers when she signed a gas deal with Russia in 2009. Prosecutors want Yulia Tymoshenko, the leader of Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution, to serve 7 years in prison. She says the trial was all about politics and not law, part of President Yanukovych's attempts to stop her challenging him.
You know very well that the sentence is not being pronounced by Judge Kiriev, but by President Yanukovych. Whatever the sentence pronounced, my struggle will continue. This sentence, written by Yanukovych, will not change anything in my life or in my struggle.
Well, riot police have been deployed outside that court in Kiev where her supporters are camped out. Our correspondent Paul Brenner is there with them.
Protesters have been coming in from all around the Ukrainian countryside by buses and by trains, both in support of Yulia Tymoshenko and vehemently against her. She's an incredibly divisive character here in Ukrainian politics. Many people thought she was a spent force, and then this trial catapulted her back into the political limelight. What the consequences are now, well, it's very difficult to say. Politically, for the president, it's going to be very difficult because both America and the EU have put considerable pressure on the Ukrainian president not to push through this prosecution. They fear it's a politically motivated prosecution. That's certainly what Mrs. Tymoshenko has claimed, and it's finding credibility among the EU and US because they want to see a stable Ukraine. There are association and trade talks going on to try and bring closer ties with Ukraine and the West, and those are undoubtedly going to be damaged if this is seen as some kind of kangaroo court, some kind of show trial. Well, what will the sentence be? That's going to be the crucial thing. If they come to some kind of deal whereby Mrs. Tymoshenko is found guilty but gets off with some kind of fine, that may be a way of saving face, but it's down to the judge as to exactly what the sentence will be, and that is still, as far as I understand it, open to question.
Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has arrived in China. His two-day visit is aimed at strengthening strategic trade ties, which could include finalizing details of a 30-year gas deal. China is Russia's largest trading partner, with trade expected to double by 2020. Well, Joseph Cheng is a professor of international politics at City University in Hong Kong. He says it's significant that Putin's first trip since he announced plans to stand again for the Russian presidency is to China.
At least there is a view in China that the present president, President Medvedev, is more interested in strengthening relations with the West. Basically, I think both Russia and China understand the increasing significance of the bilateral relationship, especially in the economic sense, because with the Western economy in bad shape, I think both Russia and China understand that they have to rely less on the Western markets and more on the BRICS group of countries, which and trade among the BRICS group of countries, in fact, has been increasing. Both sides expect the bilateral trade to increase to $100 billion US dollars in 2015 and $200 billion US dollars in 2020 from around $59.3 billion US dollars last year.
Well, a senior official in Libya's governing council says he knows where Muammar Gaddafi could be hiding. Musa al-Kuni says he thinks the deposed leader is in the southwestern desert near Libya's border with Niger and Algeria. Meanwhile, heavy fighting is continuing in two of Gaddafi's remaining strongholds, Sirte and in Beni Walid. That's where fighters say they've seized an airport. Anu Nathan reports.
Anti-Gaddafi fighters have advanced to the southern gate of Bani Walid after capturing two nearby towns from the Warfala tribe, which remains loyal to the deposed Libyan leader. This also allowed more than 100 families trapped in Bani Walid to flee the besieged town.
It was a fierce battle, but we managed to gain control of the airport and create a southern front into Bani Walid.
But their success came at a heavy price, as many of their compatriots were killed or seriously injured by militias loyal to Gaddafi.
Our fighters were very brave, but we lacked military coordination, losing many of our men in the fighting.
The heavy losses forced them to retreat to the airport and outside a field hospital in the nearby town of Shamik. But the fighters say they are regrouping and have vowed to capture Bani Walid at any cost. Anu Nathan, Al Jazeera.
Egypt's Coptic church is accusing the country's interim military government of allowing violent attacks on Christians. Hundreds of mourners gathered to bury 26 people killed in clashes with the military on Sunday. Authorities have launched an investigation. The Coptic church has called for a 3-day fast for Copts across the world, starting from Tuesday. Nearly 2 million Liberians are going to the polls to choose a president. The elections are the first the country has organised since the 14-year-long civil war ended in 2003. Well, 15 candidates are vying to unseat incumbent President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who won a Nobel Prize, you might recall, last week. Well, from Liberia's capital, Monrovia, Yvonne Ndege reports.
Supporters of the leading opposition party, the CDC, in Liberia, celebrating as if they've already won Tuesday's presidential election. They're hoping to remove Africa's only female president, 72-year-old Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, from power. They say after 6 years, she's failed to deliver jobs, reduce poverty, and fight corruption fast enough.
UP-led government has failed us, and we need a change. We suffer in the country a lot, and they came to power, brought their friends, their family from America to come and work here. I'm a graduate. I graduated St. Force 4 years ago. I'm jobless. What do you expect? We are frustrated.
And it's the celebrity status of former World Footballer of the Year, 45-year-old George Weah, that could be Sirleaf's undoing. His rags to riches story inspires many of the 75% of Liberians who lack formal employment. But he's not running as president, but as vice presidential candidate for the party, partnering with presidential candidate Winston Tubman, a former UN diplomat.
I think we have the people, we have the credibility, we are people's people.
But the challenges associated with unseating an incumbent in Africa, especially someone with the international popularity of President Sirleaf, who last week won the Nobel Peace Prize, will be enormous. The monkey still working, let the baboon wait small is her campaign slogan, meaning her work is not done and calling the opposition presidential candidates baboons. She wants another 6 years in power.
How hopeful are you that you're going to win this election?
I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I know you cannot guarantee anything. We leave it in the hands of the Liberian people, and I will accept that decision.
Around 1.8 million Liberians are registered to vote in Tuesday's election in more than 4,000 polling stations. The winner will need 50% plus one vote to avoid a runoff.
And as the day has been progressing, Yvonne Ndege has been sending us this update from Monrovia.
The opposition have really marketed their campaign on the fact that over the last 6 years since Ellen Johnson Sirleaf took power, she hasn't delivered the results that people need fast enough. The major complaint that you get when you walk around the streets of Monrovia talking to people is that unemployment is massive. Something like 75% of Liberians lack any kind of formal employment. Access to healthcare is a problem. Access to education is also a problem. And then there are infrastructure issues, power, water. There's also some hostility, you might say, that has grown over the last year or so about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And it's this feeling that she's too close to the West, too close to America, that all the opportunities, the business opportunities in Liberia tend to go to foreign companies.
Well, coming up on Al Jazeera, New Zealand's toxic tide. Teams head to the beach to clean up oil leaking from a stranded container ship. And in the olive groves of the West Bank, Palestinian farmers have begun their annual harvest. But why will this year's season only last for 3 days? The answer's coming up after the break. Welcome back. Let's recap our top stories now. A judge in Ukraine says ex-Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko exceeded her powers when she ordered state energy firm Naftogaz to sign a gas deal with Russia in 2009. In Libya, hospitals are struggling to cope with mounting casualties as fighting continues in Sirte. Wounded anti-Gaddafi fighters are being treated in the same wards as supporters of the former Libyan leader. Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has arrived in China. His two-day visit is aimed at strengthening strategic trade ties, which could include finalizing details of a 30-year gas deal. Well, the United Nations says Afghan security forces have been systematically torturing detainees, including those handed over by US and NATO troops. Well, earlier this year, NATO stopped transferring detainees to Afghan intelligence officers and police in 4 provinces. That was because of several reports of torture. Well, there are now reports NATO has stopped more transfers of detainees in response to those UN findings. The study points to a compelling pattern of systematic torture and ill treatment, as the report puts it. There are documented cases of Afghan intelligence officers beating suspects with cables, giving them electric shocks and twisting their genitals. Well, police are using stress positions and hanging detainees by their wrists during interrogations. Over half of the 379 detainees interviewed in 47 facilities had experienced torture. The report raises questions about international funding and training of Afghan security forces. Well, General Carsten Jacobson is a spokesman for NATO forces inside Afghanistan. He joins me now live from Kabul. Thanks so much for being with us. I guess the question on the minds of many, General, is how could such practices as ripping toenails out of people and twisting their genitals be carried out in a country that international forces like yours are heavily invested in helping and trying to rebuild?
Well, we were aware of the United Nations report coming up for about 4 weeks. Already in July, in the south of Afghanistan, transfer of detainees that were taken in combined operations had been stopped because we had reason to believe that they would be inhumanely treated. When we heard about the coming report, we worked very closely together with the United Nations mission and with the government of Afghanistan, who has, as the report also highlights, been very cooperative in this matter. So we are seeing systemic mistreatment in some institutions, but it is limited to some institutions where detainees were mistreated.
Sorry, sir, you're really not answering my question, though, which is, how could this level of torture be carried out when international forces like yours are heavily invested in rebuilding the country?
Well, it happened in prison installations of the National Security Service and of the Ministry of the Interior. As soon as we found out about any details and along the process in the making of this report, we immediately stopped transfer of detainees into these installations. There is a very clear process installed which starts with inspections of these installations, then goes over retraining of the personnel.
Until July, you had no idea that torture was being carried out in Afghanistan? Is that what you're telling me?
I am saying to you that we stopped transfer of detainees as soon as we found out in individual institutions where there was mistreatment. We did that already in July. We extended that program as soon as we worked together with UNAMA and with the government of Afghanistan. We first expanded it to 8 installations. We have at the moment suspended the transfer of detainees to 16 installations, and we will continue to work with the government of Afghanistan and with UNAMA on this matter.
Sir, the UN report says it has evidence from 22 people it has interviewed that they were transferred from the custody of foreign military forces to local security, and they had been tortured. Did you not know at the time you were transferring people to local Afghan forces that torture was being carried out in Afghanistan?
As it is not systemic in the Afghan prison service, but systemic in individual installations, this is the case. We have transferred, to our knowledge, out of the 379 who were questioned, 19 that were handed over to the Afghan services who came out in the investigations. Now, we have stopped immediately.
If it's a matter of numbers, I'll go with your number, 19. I mean, I just find it surprising. Many people know that torture has been documented in Afghanistan since the days of Barbara Karmal. Are you saying that when you handed over, whether it was 22 or 19, you had no idea that torture was being carried out in Afghan security forces?
We very carefully investigate the installations. and it is the individual installation where we have to find out whether torture is happening there. As we are transferring responsibility to the Afghan authorities, we have to trust in cooperation with the Afghan authorities, and literally that is what the UNAMA report quite clearly says. It actually highlights the support that the Afghan government is given to the process.
So are you saying that because you feel you have to trust and cooperate with Afghan forces, does that make you to overlook torture when you're handing over suspects prior to July?
Trust comes along with control, and that is exactly the process that we are doing. We are looking, we are investigating into the installations, we are retraining when it is necessary, we are certifying before we are taking up again the process of handing prisoners. It hasn't happened so far. In the installations where we stopped the transfer of detainees, we haven't taken it up again because we are not through the process. We will support in accountability where we have to, and we will make sure that this is a very visible process observed by the public.
So I really feel you're not answering the question I've asked you. You've explained very clearly that you're looking into things and trying to fix the situation, but the real question is, when you've been handing over suspects to Afghan forces, did you have no idea torture was being carried out?
We knew that there were certain installations in which mistreatment was happening, and that is why we already in July, long before the UNAMA report, stopped the transfer of detainees to certain facilities down in the south. In very close cooperation with UNAMA and the government of Afghanistan, we have stopped since then, in altogether 16 installations, the transfer of detainees.
So if you knew that mistreatment occurred in some prisons and some facilities, how did you go on transferring suspects?
Well, not the entire prison system of Afghanistan is under suspicion. And it is very clear this is individual facilities in which this mistreatment happened there systemically, as the report highlights. But it is not the entire Afghan prison system in which this mistreatment happens. So therefore we are looking at the individual installations, and we are then taking very clear steps as the Geneva Convention demands.
Do you think that international forces then bear some responsibility, at least some negligence, if, in your own words, you knew that torture was being carried out in some facilities while you were transferring suspects to them?
As I've just explained to you, as soon as we got any information that in a particular installation mistreatment was happening, we immediately stopped the transfer of detainees to those facilities. We immediately initiated the 6-step process that I've highlighted to you earlier. So there is, on the side of the international force, where the only thing in question is whether we transfer detainees into the hands of the Afghan authorities or not, every step was taken timely, quickly, rapidly, and everything that we had to do to support the real findings and to come over this problem, we have done.
According to the UN report, not quick enough for 22 people it spoke to. There's plenty more questions, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, General Jacobson. Well, floods in Southeast Asia have left at least 500 people dead across Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam. Well, unusually heavy and prolonged monsoon rains are creating dangerous conditions. 207 people, including 83 children, have been killed in Cambodia in the worst flooding for more than a decade. Well, hundreds of thousands of families have seen their homes and livelihoods destroyed by the rising waters. In Thailand, more than 250 people have been killed and thousands are fleeing their homes. Authorities are battling to protect the low-lying capital Bangkok from rising flood waters. Wayne Hay is in the northern Thai city of Ayutthaya for us.
Well, this is a scene that has so many residents and officials in Thailand's capital Bangkok worried. This is to the north of the capital city in Ayutthaya, and so much of the floodwaters that are lying around in the northern parts of Thailand are now heading towards the capital city Bangkok, and the government is now trying to divert a lot of that water away from the capital city, but still evacuation centres are being set up around Bangkok should parts of the city flood. For now, in areas like Ayutthaya to the north of Bangkok, the situation remains very critical. So much of this province has been inundated by flood waters. Residents continue to leave their homes, carrying with them what possessions they can. And for many of them, the places they are going to are the sides of roads, because the roads are really the only dry areas around. So they are setting up here, and this is where they plan to stay. They don't want to go too far away from their homes for fear that they will lose other valuable possessions inside. And we're hearing reports that there are still residents stranded in their homes in Ayutthaya waiting for outside assistance to arrive.
The Syrian government's violent crackdown on pro-democracy protests isn't just damaging relations with other countries, it's breaking the country's economy too. Well, aside from international sanctions, a sharp drop in investment and tourism is having a wider impact, as Jazeera explains.
This is the updated version of an ancient trade route. On the highway through Jordan, Turkish trucks roll through from Syria on their way to the Gulf. Goods from Jordan and Iraq head for Syrian ports to reach the Mediterranean. But the Arab tourists Syria used to depend on and the currency they bring have almost disappeared. At this exchange shop near the Jazeera border crossing, Majid Zovi says the Syrian currency has been fluctuating so much it no longer has a fixed rate.
After the events intensified and demonstrations began to grow and spread to all areas, and international sanctions by the European Union and America, it started to directly affect the Syrian pound.
With its biggest export, oil, under embargo by the European Union, Syria is still exporting textiles and food. In recent years, Syria's socialist economy has opened up and factories modernized as the country tries to bring its products up to European standards. A lot of this clothing is made in Syria. Shop owners say it's better quality than Chinese goods, and they say so far the supply hasn't been disrupted. Unlike other parts of the country, this clothing is made in factories in the north, in Aleppo, which has been relatively quiet. But in other cities across the border, the unrest has shut factories and cut into trade by small businessmen. Since the uprising began, Syria has barred Jordanian merchants from going past a trading zone just inside the border. They load up these taxis with as much as they can to sell back in Jordan. The unrest and uncertainty has raised the price of Syrian produce in Jordanian markets. The huge agricultural tribal areas have been among the hardest hit by the Syrian government crackdown. This former consultant to the EU for Syria says the government is likely to abandon the economic reform it had started.
I think Syrians have proven to be very agile. They will adjust as a regime to the trade. The suffering will increase. But yeah, it will go back to being a very depressed economy, but will survive.
Syria had been working on stronger trade ties with Russia, China, and India as a counterweight to the West. If the trade sanctions widen, Syria will likely look towards its trading partners in the East to cushion the blow. Jane Araf, Al Jazeera, on the Jordanian-Syrian border.
The olive harvest season has begun in the Palestinian territories, and time is of the essence. Israel has imposed deadlines on farmers to harvest their crop. They say it's to protect them from attacks by Israeli settlers. Palestinian farmers disagree. Charles Stratford reports now from the West Bank.
It should be one of the happiest times of the year for Abu Riyad and his family, a time when they gather to harvest their olives. But this year they have to work fast and to a deadline. They say that Israeli authorities have given them 3 days to harvest their crop. The Israeli authorities say they are trying to protect the Palestinian farmers from attacks by settlers.
Of course, people lose a lot of money. When people pick the olives before they are ripe, they do not produce quality oil. Emotionally, when we are nervous, we cannot pick large quantities. I brought my children from school and told them to come help their uncle.
This is near the settlement of Awata. Settlers came down from their illegal outpost above the olive grove, and after pelting the harvesters with stones, they set fire to their trees. And it was a similar story down the road near the village of Kusra. This is the aftermath of what seems a pretty systematic attempt to destroy the livelihood of this olive grower. Now, these trees are around 15 years old, and they would have produced around $150 worth of olives a year. To our left, over this hill here, around 300 metres away, is an Israeli army checkpoint, and it's very close to a settler's outpost. All the trees in this orchard would have netted the farmer thousands of dollars this harvest season alone. Locals say the Israeli soldiers turn a blind eye to the violence.
I feel that these actions that the settlers commit with the protection of the army is organised terrorism. But this does not prevent us from replanting our trees again and again and not give up.
Al Jazeera was granted access to one of the settlements close by. This is Tapwa. Israeli security man the gates. The community started as a couple of caravans 33 years ago. Now around 200 families live here. We asked the community spokesman if we could talk to residents, but he wouldn't let us go alone, and he said we should leave.
I think that the situation where the olive harvest has been used as cover for terrorism has caused the result that the military needs to be active and involved in administrating the olive harvest around the Jewish communities. The concept that Jewish people need to leave this area in order to bring peace is an outrageous idea.
In the olive grove down the road, Abu Riyad's family work as fast as they can. Their simple pleasure of harvest time has been lost again. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, the occupied West Bank.
All right, let's recap our headlines now. A judge in Ukraine says former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko used her powers in office to criminal ends. Tymoshenko is accused of exceeding her authority by signing a natural gas contract with Russia in 2009. Well, prosecutors wanted to go to jail for 7 years. Paul Brennan is in Kiev.
She's an incredibly divisive character here in Ukrainian politics. Many people thought she was a spent force, and then this trial catapulted her back into the political limelight. What the consequences are now, well, it's very difficult to say. Politically, for the president, it's going to be very difficult because both America and the EU have put considerable pressure on the Ukrainian president not to push through this prosecution. They fear it's a politically motivated prosecution.
Floods in Southeast Asia have left at least 500 people dead across Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam. Unusually heavy and prolonged monsoon rains are creating deadly conditions. 207 people have been killed in Cambodia in the worst flooding for more than a decade. Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has arrived in China. His two-day visit is aimed at strengthening strategic trade ties, which could include finalizing details of a 30-year gas deal. In Libya, residents of Muammar al-Gaddafi's hometown Sirte still trying to flee the city amid fierce fighting. NTC fighters say they now control 70% of the area, but the city's hospitals are struggling to cope with casualties. Myanmar has announced an amnesty for thousands of prisoners in a move that could mean some of the country's 2,000 political detainees could soon be free. More than 6,300 elderly, sick or well-behaved prisoners will be pardoned from Wednesday on humanitarian grounds, according to state television. Voting is underway in Liberia as the country chooses a new president. Incumbent Ellen Johnson Sirleaf will face former UN diplomat Winston Tubman and footballing hero George Weah, among other candidates at the polls. An oil spill in New Zealand has become the country's worst maritime environmental disaster. Oil is now leaking at 5 times the rate it had been since the container ship grounded on a reef last Thursday. Well, up to 350 tons of oil have poured into the sea, and officials say it could wash up on beaches for weeks to come. Well, those are your headlines. The news continues here in Al Jazeera. After slavery, a 21st century evil. Stay with us. I'm Sami Zeidan in Doha with the stories making the headlines here on Al Jazeera now. A judge in Ukraine says ex-Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko clearly exceeded her powers when she ordered state energy firm Naftogaz to sign a gas deal with Russia in 2009. Well, riot police were outside the court where supporters of Tymoshenko waited to hear the verdict. Tymoshenko and her supporters say the trial was ordered by President Viktor Yanukovych to remove her from power. Floods in Southeast Asia have left at least 500 people dead across Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam. Unusually heavy and prolonged monsoon rains are creating deadly conditions. 207 people have been killed in Cambodia in the worst flooding for more than a decade. An oil spill in New Zealand has become the country's worst maritime environmental disaster. Up to 350 tons of oil have poured into the sea off the Bay of Plenty. Officials say it could wash up on beaches for weeks to come. Nearly 2 million Liberians are voting for a new president. Tuesday's election is the first the country has organized since the end of its civil war in 2003. The 16 candidates include